My entire childhood, my father and I used to take late-night walks due to his insomnia from shift work. Our neighborhood is considered very safe and ultimately was an urban neighborhood, besides one of the roads towards the back of the neighborhood being lined with thick forest for about 1.25 miles deep, which made a circle back in itself. All of these walks were very dear memories of mine, except one, and it ended up being the last one. Along the road with the tree line, there was a single streetlight to illuminate a small plot of land that someone owned, but was very overgrown and ill-kept. It was very common for us to walk this road to enjoy the sounds of the forest, the lack of illumination, and the ease of circling back. One ordinary night, as we're walking and making conversation, my father abruptly stops, pulls me close, puts a hand over my mouth, crouches with me, and points towards the single illuminated plot roughly 100 yards away. At first, I didn't see anything and thought he was pulling my leg, but just as I began to protest his grasp, I see a very small humanoid figure, roughly 3 feet in height, scrawny with long limbs, materialize out of the plot's bush line and cautiously take in its surroundings before signaling towards the bush. After a few seconds, 2 other small humanoid figures materialize as well. After a brief moment of what looked to be a discussion, all 3 made a dash for the forest tree line. Once this happened, my father picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and made a break for home, which was roughly a half-mile back. Mind you, my father is 6'5", 220 pounds, and I was roughly 120 pounds at this time, and he never showed signs of slowing due to his fear and adrenaline. After this night, we never took late-night walks. He installed 4 bright motion-detecting lights around our acre plot and brought a dog home. The few times I tried bringing it up, he doesn't want to discuss and made it clear that he never wanted to. Those figures still give me chills, and the image of the 3 huddled together is very vivid 15 years later. This happened about 5 years ago, out in Pennsylvania. My brother is a major hiking enthusiast who's hiked all 46 high peaks in the Adirondacks. He lives in Colorado and brags about hiking 14ers with his buddies all the time, like it's no big deal. So him coming home to PA to hike the Loyalsock River with me was a prime opportunity for him to downplay the terrain and talk about how he'd have me hiking all 57 miles in 2 days, because this was nothing compared to out west. I don't think he believed me when I told him how wet it was going to be. But he knows everything. Whatever, he's a jerk, but I missed him and had been wanting to hike this for a while, so I thought it would be nice to catch up and hang out. So we hike, and inevitably my brother did not bring enough socks after getting our feet soaked in the creeks and mud, and he was pissy when he reached the campsite. We didn't get to go as far as he wanted. We set up camp, and he hangs his 2 pairs of socks to dry, and we crack open some cold ones. It's relatively early but dark out, and we were the only people around. We heard some clanging noises off in the distance at one point, something being struck against something else. But it was far off to the north, and in the woods, and kind of scattered. We got tired pretty quick and hit the sack. I couldn't fall asleep for a while because my gut was backed up from traveling. You know, like when you go on vacation and you're ready to relax, and next thing you know, you can't go to the bathroom? Yeah, my stomach was just starting to move, and it was really uncomfortable. And I was just staring up at the trees and the stars through the mesh top of the tent. I could tell my brother couldn't sleep either because he was rolling around a lot. Eventually, he snaps at me and asks what the heck I'm doing. I guess I was keeping him up, trying to get comfortable. Dude, I gotta go try and take a dump, I told him. He was like, okay, I gotta take a piss anyway. So he heads out into the trees with me. We walked a ways away from the trail because you don't want to take a dump too close to the water source or near your campsite. I'm squatted and my brother is a few yards away waiting for me to finish my business. Next thing you know, he's like sneaking toward me, going, "Dude, dude, dude, look." Moving through the woods were three huge figures, and a smaller one that was still pretty big. I can't make heads or tails of it through the trees, and all I can really tell is that these things are walking upright and had really long gaits. I'm just trying not to make any noise as I hike up my pants and try to get my eyes to focus through the dark. Right as they passed closest to us, still a few yards away, I almost feel, more than I see, my brother reach for his side, and I said, "No!" My brother always carries a pistol hiking because out west there's grizzly bears and whatnot. But this is PA. We don't have grizzlies, and he knows that. But these creatures heard and took off running. They were so big and their limbs so long that it almost looked like they were moving in slow motion. But they were running. So we took off running too, back to camp. Back in the tent, feeling stupidly safer zipped up inside, we were really quiet for a while. Then my brother starts sniggering and imitated me in a squeaky voice. "No!" I just glared at him. "Come on, bro," he says. "I wasn't gonna shoot. It was just in case they charged." I don't think either of us slept much, but my brother tried to play it cool like nothing happened the night before. We pack up, and right as we step back onto the trail, just outside of the campsite, we find a fresh, ripped-up possum, still leaking blood out onto the trail. My brother took off, shaking his head no, like he was refusing to accept what he saw. From that moment through the rest of the hike, my brother regularly touched his gun on his hip like he was checking it was still there. I teased him the rest of the time, telling him Sasquatch was going to get him. But honestly, I think I did it because I was just as freaked out as he was. Yesterday, I noticed my neighbor hadn't put out all his Halloween decorations yet. For the past 2 years that I lived next to him, he's gone all out for Halloween. I don't know him well. He's younger, single, but I know that he's really good with kids. He loves Halloween. His brother and sister-in-law and their kids are always visiting him, and he plays with his 3 young nieces and nephews out in the yard. So anyway, I got home from work and was walking up my driveway and saw him outside and said something like, "Hey man, you better get your Halloween stuff up or that house up the street is going to beat you for best decorations." He kind of smiles sheepishly and says that he's actually going to keep his house dark this year and just put candy outside. I asked him if he was going out of town, but he said no. Something happened last year that really scared him. Now I was concerned for my own safety if some weirdos were coming around our neighborhood, which is a pretty safe neighborhood with tons of young families living there. So I asked him what happened. He said last year he had his brother's family over so they could trick-or-treat in the neighborhood, since they live in an apartment complex that doesn't do much for Halloween. He had a bunch of kids come to the door like always. His family took off around 10:30, and there were only a few older trick-or-treaters, but by 11:30 they were pretty much done. So he was inside watching TV and the doorbell rings. He grabs a candy bowl and heads over, noticing that it's a little past midnight, and that's pretty rude for trick-or-treaters to still be out. But then he notices that he hasn't turned off all of his decorations and lights yet, so his house is still a beacon. He swings the door open and is about to yell "boo" or something to freak them out, but he stops dead when he sees the kids at the door. He said one was probably around 13 or 14, and the other was 16 or 17, both boys. They weren't dressed up, but he remembers the older one was wearing a flannel checkered shirt. He was immediately overcome with uneasiness, like opening the door was a huge mistake. They just stared at him, and he noticed that they had really big irises and dilated pupils. He couldn't even see the whites of their eyes, so he figured they were contact lenses. He was frozen there, holding the candy bowl like he couldn't slam the door in their face as much as he wanted to. So he nervously tried to smile at them, hoping they would break character and ask for candy or something. The younger one said that they had gotten lost and needed to come inside to use his phone. And that's when he closed the door more than halfway on them and said, "No, sorry." The older one said something like, "Can we just wait in your house until our parents come and get us?" But by then he was convinced that his life was in danger, and these kids must be high on something or intending to rob him. He just kept mumbling, "No, I'm sorry, good night," as he inched the door closed and locked it. He told me he was so scared at that point that they were going to try and break through one of the windows or something. But he looked through the peephole and they had turned to leave. He watched TV with the volume really low so he could hear any sounds at all. He said that he stayed up until 5 a.m. because he was too scared to go to bed and drop his guard. The whole time he's telling me this, I'm thinking, oh my God, this sounds so familiar. Just like the Black-Eyed Kids urban legend. Then I think, hey, maybe this dude's trying to scare me because after all, he does have the Halloween spirit. So I'm looking at him incredulously, but trying not to seem too gullible. So I'm like, man, that's really crazy. Sounds like the Black-Eyed Kids. He just looked at me blankly. The what? Is that a movie or something? And I said, no, but I told him to go look it up online. Like an hour later, I get a knock on my door, and admittedly, I almost jumped out of my skin, thinking there was a demon child at my door. It was my neighbor, and his eyes were freaking huge. He swears to me up and down that he had never heard of Black-Eyed Kids before, and that what he read was so familiar to what happened to him. So we take a while longer, and I told him that quite a few people probably know about the urban legend. It's possible it was just teenagers with black scleral contacts trying to freak people out on Halloween, which would be genius, by the way. But he said the fear he felt was so primal and came over him the second that he opened the door, that it just had to be something paranormal. Last night was like any other night. I was switching between listening to music and watching YouTube videos, with one earbud in, so I could hear my infant daughter if she cried. That way, my wife could get a full night's sleep. She works at 4 a.m. at the hospital every day. That was about the time I decided to go lay down in the spare bed in the baby's room. Just as I dozed off, I heard a thumping coming from my front porch. Startled at first, I opened my eyes wide and scanned the room, and realizing it was most likely my cat scratching himself on the front porch, I dozed back off. Then, again, I heard the thumping. "Darn cat," I mumbled. I got out of bed to run him off the porch, only to see that he wasn't there anymore. Now that I was up again, I wasn't the least bit tired. Figured I'll just get some tea and check Facebook while I'm up. Maybe finish the web series I was watching on YouTube. A few minutes into the video, I felt the sudden urge to look up at the kitchen window. And there they were, the top of two short-statured people's heads cresting the stairs just above my window frame. The people were just short enough not to see in the window, but I could see out. I heard no footsteps on my porch as my stomach turned. But the knock was a steady, hollow thump. The very same thump that I had just blamed on my cat. Deciding it was best not to answer, I shut my laptop and crept by the back door up to the baby's room. I assumed it was some of the people from the housing district across the road. Maybe they were high or hiding from cops, or looking for my cousin who stays with me often and has a lot of friends over there. The last thing I needed was to try to explain to two stoners that I was trying to sleep, even though it was 2 a.m. It wasn't until I got to my daughter's room that the creepiness set in. The thump had moved from the kitchen to the bedroom windows, both windows, a room apart, thumping in perfect time. These stoners were going to wake up my daughter if I didn't run them off now. Angry, I went out to the kitchen, unlocked and opened the door, ready to run outside of the house and kick some little idiots' butts. It happened then. Standing there, looking up at me, were two 10 or 11-year-old boys. The feeling of dread and the smell of mold almost made me vomit. And then the smaller of the two boys spoke. "May we use your telegraph?" "Huh?" I just stared blankly at these boys, horrified of what I then realized. Their eyes were pitch black. He asked again to use my telegraph. There wasn't a sound to be heard. No crickets chirping, dogs, cars, nothing. I tried to play it cool and ignore the fact that he didn't say telephone or phone or cell or anything that would have made sense of the situation. And I calmly replied, "I don't have service at my house. Sorry." The expressions on their faces turned to rage as soon as I finished my sentence. Swiftly I shut the door and locked it as quickly as I could, and then stumbled back to protect my daughter. I picked her up from the crib and held her close. The fact that she didn't wake up freaked me out the most, but I managed to gather my senses enough to make sure she was still breathing and warm. Everything seemed okay with her. The thumping on the windows was back. I dropped to the floor as close to the wall as I could and held my little girl in my arms and wept like a child. I felt helpless and afraid. I lied there for what felt like hours and hours, crying and shaking until I heard it. My wife's alarm clock. The thumping stopped the instant the alarm went off, and I crept into the master bedroom with the baby. "What's wrong with you?" my wife asked. "I just had a bad dream." That's all I could mutter. "Okay, well, give me the baby so I can feed her before work." I handed my wife the baby, and she fed her like any normal day. I turned on every light in the house and made coffee for her, and for some reason just having her awake calmed my nerves enough to pretend like nothing had happened. I walked her out to the car nervously with the baby in my arms. I asked her not to leave until I walked back into the house. She was a little put off by the request, but did so to humor me. Once I was safely in the house, I locked the door again, and in the house I sat horrified until she got home. I insisted we go to the next town over and stay the weekend at my brother's house. And here I sit, horrified while she sleeps in the guest room with our daughter, wondering why they stopped when the alarm went off. I think I know the answer. I was aware of the black-eyed kids. She wasn't. Every story I've ever read about them is from someone who already knew about them. Maybe, just maybe, knowledge of them existing is the only reason they visit. I'm afraid, and I'm sorry. I'm scared, and I can't calm down. My husband suddenly decided to divorce me, but it's not him or the divorce I'm afraid of. I think something was attached to him, and like a leech, attached itself to me. I am away from him now, but after an emotional phone call, I think the thing has reattached itself to me. The first 10 years of our relationship, my soon-to-be ex-husband was a young man who tried to uphold his farm boy values and worked very hard. He was kind and considerate, although there were a few times that, now, looking back, there were red flags that his mask slipped, or that a secret rage he was holding back came peeking through. In our first apartment, he did some things that freaked me out. The biggest being I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him leaning over me, his face an inch from mine. I'd try and get him to lie back down, but he was difficult to wake, just hovering over me. Sometimes he'd talk back to me, one time saying, "Go in through the mouth." I thought it was gibberish because he spoke of reptile scales and types of rocks, things he had no interest in. The longer we were together, the less it happened, until, as far as I know, he stopped. His hidden side really started to show when I was bit by a tick and became very sick with Lyme disease. It hadn't worked regularly since. It destroyed me. Granted, I had a handful of medical problems that were difficult to pin down, including my ribs caving in. But I worked when I could, especially around the holidays, to help out. Sometimes when I'd tried to talk to him about something silly around the house, he'd lose his temper. He'd get close and scream at me, suddenly gaslighting me and putting me down for choices regarding my work and health I thought we'd made together. But this was so few and far between. I chalked it up to the stress of his work, or being the sole breadwinner. I tried to do my part to be his cheerleader, no matter what, managing the finances and keeping up on what I could physically manage in the house. Then his father died. Let me give you a little background on him. My ex-husband was one of many children, and Dad was a bit of a crook. He always excused his father's means of making money when they grew up, saying he had to do it to support all of us. By the time I started dating my husband, his father lived in the basement of the house. He loved strip clubs and drinking and left filth and adult toys out where all the kids could see, because the laundry room was right there next to the couch he slept on, which was also next to the computer he loudly played dirty videos on. We could all hear the moaning and noises through the floor. His father also liked to secretly tuck away the liquor in great binges, something the now teenagers knew little about, until they found bottles hidden around the basement when he moved when their parents divorced. Before he died, he drank copious amounts of wine outright. There was a lot of vicious fighting in that house. His father always seemed the darkest when he'd come out of the basement after a long time alone. Periods of time where we couldn't hear dirty videos playing through the floor, where it was utterly silent from below. One night, when we were in our late teens or early 20s, I was hanging out with my ex-husband in his room. My husband decided to take a shower, and I laid on the bed watching TV. About 15 minutes later, he came into his bedroom looking freaked out. I asked him what was wrong, and he said when he went down to the laundry room, grabbed clean clothes from the dryer, he saw his dad in his tighty whities, hunched before the dark corner under the stairs. When he asked him what he was doing, his dad only mumbled. My ex walked closer, trying to figure out what was going on, and his dad swung around like Gollum, clutching the ring, and growled, "F off!" His brothers had also seen strange incidents. Only one of them, who later became a Reiki master, admitted that there was a horrid, dark energy that emanated from beneath those stairs. He claims it was a dark portal to this day. The rest of the family doesn't talk about the negative things about their dad since his death, or at least very rarely. When they do, it never includes the basement. My husband became darker, quieter after his dad passed when we were in our late 20s, a tension surrounding him that never really left. Back to modern day. My husband became withdrawn. There were days he was present, and other days where he made me feel like a terrible person for speaking to him while he hid in the basement playing video games. I tried to have conversations with him about jobs I thought I could handle, but he wouldn't hear of it. "No, your health is my #1 priority. I don't want you working right now." To back up a minute, my biggest physical complaint is my chest caving in. Since moving in with my ex, my ribs started to fall inward, creating a bowl of sorts in my chest. It happens to people with autoimmune issues. This is very painful and makes it difficult to breathe. Just keep this symptom in mind moving forward. Soon, all my ex did was hide in the basement, drinking as much as he could hide, but I had an idea. I'd set the ultimatum he'd get sober 3 years before, and I knew from his brief relapses that isolating was a big red flag. He'd binge drink like his dad did, causing embarrassing scenes at weddings and parties, but most importantly, wrecking his health and hurting our marriage. After asking his brother for advice, I approached my ex-husband about his cleanliness around the house. He'd become sloppy, leaving clothes in piles that the cat peed on, and even once they'd been peed on, he'd walk right past them. I refused to clean them up. He was unsanitary in the kitchen, breading chicken or eggplant on the countertop using raw eggs and leaving it for me to clean. He became so vicious so quickly when I approached him, throwing things around the kitchen, screaming at me with his finger in my face and backing me up into a corner. He just kept telling me that I should be more grateful because I had an unwillingness to work. But hadn't he discouraged me from multiple jobs I'd considered lately? I was still backed into the corner. He would not move, just stood there heaving, staring at me. So I pushed him so I could get out. How dare he intimidate me, a woman with his size, and how dare he gaslight me? But also I was scared. His eyes, bright and gray, seemed to go dark with rage. The next day, when I asked him to promise not to do that to me again, he kept screaming, "Who pushed who?" Keeping a distance, I followed him as he ranted and raved and slipped into the basement bathroom. He didn't know I was a ways outside the bathroom recording on my phone. He needed proof of these rages, and I didn't want him to come out and corner me again, or do something worse, which I doubted he would do on camera. All I could hear him saying was, "It's distorted, so distorted." Then, after repeating this over a dozen times, he slipped into mumbling, and I thought he said something about scales in his mouth. I called my father to get me out of there, and my parents took me into their home. My ex-husband wrote me a horribly degrading letter soon after, in which he told me he wanted a divorce. Since moving in with my parents while I got on my feet, the bowl in my chest, or cave-in, started to heal. I could actually feel the bottom of my sternum again. The ribs slipping back into their natural position is painful within itself. But my God, I could breathe again. I chalked it up to being away from him, thinking the building abuse had been triggering my autoimmune issues. And now I was free. He called me a few nights ago, and he was horribly drunk. We haven't spoken in weeks. He was slurring and crying, really bad off. He had gotten in trouble at work for going into a rage at a coworker, telling him to F off or he'd knock his lights out. "It felt so good," he sobbed. I talked him off the ledge and got his siblings to check in on him. That night, I woke up to him leaning over me in my bed. Shocked and scared, I whispered his name, and he said nothing. I tried to tell him he shouldn't be here, that he had to leave. As I hyperventilated with fear, he said, "The scales go in through the mouth." Next thing I knew, I was waking up the next morning, and I assumed it was a dream. But now my ribs are collapsing, but rapidly this time. In my back, the muscles stretch as the ribs spread apart, ligaments cracking, and in the front, the muscles are pinched between ribs collapsing inward. I can't breathe. I can hardly stand. It is agony. I've been admitted to the hospital and they keep trying to relax my muscles, but they're hardening. They're talking about emergency surgery now, but I doubt it will matter. My ribs will just collapse inward again, crushing my lungs and heart. I think there was a dark entity in his father that fed off the crimes he committed. I think the entity took interest in my husband, and when his dad died, it transferred completely to him, where it could feed off of me. I'm scared, lying in the hospital bed. I'll take any suggestions on how to stop it before my organs are crushed. I hope you enjoyed tonight's scary stories. If you did, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you have a story that you would like read on this channel, please send it to me at madamhorror1@gmail.com. Join me next time for more tales of the unknown.